everybody. Welcome back to Fireside Chat with a Naturopath, brought to you by Scale Up Naturopath, a digital media technology company whose mission is to increase awareness of the naturopathic industry across Canada. I am your host, Dr. Christina Diavila, naturopath and certified diabetes educator. And our guest today was voted Best Naturopath in Toronto in 2019 by Toronto Star Readers' Choice Awards. And it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Pamela Frank. She is a graduate of the Canadian College of Naturopathic Medicine and has been licensed in Toronto since 1999. Previously, she was a medical laboratory technologist at Humber River Regional Hospital. Dr. Pamela has experience successfully helping people overcome many health problems, including allergies, skin conditions, digestive disorders, anxiety and depression, hormone imbalances, weight loss, and much more. She has a special interest in women's health and infertility issues. So welcome, Dr. Pamela Frank.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thanks. And our topic today is the impact of stress on female hormones. And I think there's so much to dive in with this topic. So let's start off with the basics and really covering what is stress and how does it impact hormones?
So stress is just a feeling of discomfort often that people feel, and they may manifest it as anxiety. They may manifest it as just feeling uncomfortable in a given situation. It can be more of a situational problem, or it may be more just a generalized anxiety where they feel just generally unable to cope, feeling overwhelmed. And hormone imbalance is just where hormones aren't quite where they ought to be. And what I find is that with most hormones, there's this delicate balance. So where you want this happy medium, you don't want too much of any given hormone, but you also don't want too little of it. And where people do fall into either extreme is where they start to manifest symptoms of hormone imbalance. So they might associate it with things like acne or irregular cycles or hot flashes or premenstrual syndrome. But each of these are signs or symptoms that hormones are not exactly where they ought to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, it is that wide range of symptoms. It's not just one specific thing, and in different people, it can manifest in different ways. So in your experience, Dr. Pamela Frank, who is most impacted by these issues with respect to hormone imbalance, and why?
Well, so we know that estrogen has an impact on how women are able to manage their stress level. So obviously anyone whose estrogen isn't where it ought to be is going to be affected, but that might be primarily women that are menstruating women. And so that means throughout their cycle, there may be certain points of their cycle where they actually are able to cope and handle stress more easily, where estrogen might be at its peak, and other points of the cycle where they can't handle stress quite as easily, because at that point, estrogen has dropped. Maybe they're about to get their period, and it's something people often feel or manifested that they just they feel more overwhelmed, they're more emotional, they're more sensitive, and that's a point where estrogen is at a lower ebb. For women who are post-menopause, who have consistently lower levels of estrogen, they're obviously going to potentially have more difficulty with coping with stress, where they just have a consistently lower level of estrogen. And that's where they may experience more anxiety, more depression, more feelings of overwhelm in a situation that when they were younger, perhaps wouldn't have affected them as much.
And when people do sort of present with this hormone imbalance, what are the biggest impacts that you see that it has on their quality of life, or even maybe the people around them, whether they're a significant other or even a parent of, let's say, a young adolescent or, a prepubescent teen who's starting to go through that transition?
Right, because you're absolutely right at those particular points, like points where there's a great amount of hormonal transition going on. So pre-puberty or puberty, adolescents, teenagers. Women who have just delivered a child obviously can be very emotional, and that's because there's a huge amount of hormonal disruption going on at that point. Women who are pregnant, they're at much higher levels of estrogen and progesterone than they typically have. Women at menopause or who are perimenopausal, who are in that point where estrogen and progesterone are all over until they actually finally settle into menopause. So that then has an impact on their relationships with other people. It has an impact on their sleep. If you don't sleep well, you're not as tolerant of other people or as tolerant of stress. And then it also impacts things like how their mood is. So anxiety or depression, their capacity of handling stress, their reproductive health is impacted. And all of that is dependent on having the optimal level of hormones. And it depends too on which hormones are being disrupted. So with estrogen, obviously, is a key one that's being affected around menopause and perimenopause, premenstrually also, because it's at its lowest ebb just before your period and at the beginning of your period. So estrogen is a key one just because it has a great deal of variability built into it in a given cycle. But in the case of progesterone also, that there's no progesterone much produced leading up to ovulation, so the first half of the cycle. Then from ovulation onwards, then there's a peak about a week after ovulation and then a drop again. So a fair bit of variability in female hormones, and because of that, a fair variability in stress tolerance. And the symptoms that can be manifested. So if progesterone's low, there could be symptoms of anxiety or insomnia, waking up at night, endometriosis, painful periods, PMS symptoms, low libido, and infertility. Where with estrogen, if it's low, then there can be vaginal dryness, there can be low libido, there can be tendency to urinary tract infections, or other infections, lower mood, depression, more emotional. High levels of estrogen will cause different set of symptoms. So there might be more endometriosis and heavy periods and being more emotional, and clots and menstrual flow, acne problems, skin problems. And prolactin is kind of another key one that's not as much appreciated or understood, but it's one that can be overly high in periods of stress. And because of that, the high amounts of prolactin can create their own set of symptoms. So there may be more problems with irregular cycles and vaginal dryness and acne and even mood things like depression, anxiety, and even to the extent of psychosis from high levels of prolactin.
That's a lot going on.
Yeah. And, obviously that's going to impact not only yourself, but also the people around you.
Yeah. And I think the important thing that you really highlighted there, Dr. Pamela Frank, is, where in the cycle, what is that dynamic interplay? Which hormone is maybe a little higher and could be indicating that this is where we need to look and kind of identify as a possible area to explore and dive into with patients. And another thing that I actually wanted to ask is, with the people who come in to see you, and especially with your interest with women's health, do you find that people consider this their normal? Like, I have painful periods, acne that happens with my period, that's completely normal. Do you find that those statements often come in your conversation?
Oh, absolutely. What people identify as normal is symptoms that are common. So it is common for women to be emotional around their cycle. It's common for their face to break out. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's normal, and it may be signs that things are not optimal. So that's where, as naturopathic doctors, we tend to look at things from a little bit more of a critical eye as to, we don't want you just to have average health. We want you to have optimal health. And part of optimal health is optimal hormone balance. And so if you're seeing little niggling kind of symptoms and you're just taking those for granted, they may not have to be symptoms that you have to live with, or especially the painful periods. I see women who come in regularly who say, like, I'm just absolutely debilitated. I cannot function. I have to curl up in bed. I have to have a hot water bottle, and I have to take Tylenol, or I cannot function. Or even then, I cannot function for at least 1 or 2 days every month. And I can't imagine the anticipation of having to endure that every single month, and having to associate that this is, how my body functions, and it's so awful, where it doesn't have to be that awful. There's, thousands of women that I've worked with over the 20 years I've been practicing, and a lot of them have been surprised to find out that their period can just come. It
Mm-hmm.
can just start, and then it can just stop, and then that's it.
Yeah.
And, it's to me, it's surprising that so many women just accept that this is what I have to live with.
Mm-hmm. And it's almost like when they get to that point of it comes, it goes, and there's nothing more to it than just that. It's almost like they fall in love with their body again and can
Right,
appreciate
right,
their hormones for exactly what they are.
right. That's no longer something just to be endured and dreaded every single cycle.
Mm-hmm. Um, Dr. Pamela Frank, I love how you've talked about estrogen, progesterone, prolactin, all these sort of hormones that are part of the women's cycle. When it does come to stress and we start to look at that, notorious stress hormone, the beautiful cortisol that floats around, how does that sort of shift the picture and maybe even influence a little more of that anxiety and depression picture that you've been talking about?
Right, so estrogen seems to have a moderating influence on the stress response. There have been studies that showed that women that had the highest levels of estrogen showed significantly less release of the stress hormone cortisol when they were subjected to something stressful compared to women who had low levels of estrogen. So additionally, those women also reported lower subjective distress. So they didn't perceive things to be as stressful when they were subjected to the same stressful task when they had higher levels of estrogen versus the women who had lower levels of estrogen. So it just does point to, certainly there's going to be a cyclical variability in stress tolerance. So how well you feel that you have resilience, how well you feel like you can handle something. For women who are postmenopause, again, who have kind of just consistently lower levels, they may just find that, something that wouldn't have stressed them premenopause now will tend to be more stressful. We can just partly be sensitive to that, be aware of the fact that, okay, this is a point of a cycle or point of someone's life where they just maybe are not going to be able to handle it as well. But then there's all the things that we know as naturopathic doctors that can be nurturing and help to cultivate the body's ability to maintain the appropriate amounts of certain hormones. The other influence on a lot of that too is there's a weak male hormone called DHEAS, which is produced by our adrenal glands. 100% of it comes from your adrenal glands. DHEAS acts as a moderator for estrogen. It acts to balance it. So the estrogen receptors can be more or less sensitive to estrogen depending on the level of estrogen that you have. So if you have a lot of estrogen, DHEAS can act to moderate those receptors down a little so that you're not overly reactive to it. And likewise, if estrogen's too low, DHEAS can act to improve the sensitivity of the estrogen receptors so that they will pick it up more readily. So your stress tolerance is also somewhat dictated by your DHEAS level, which is regulated by your adrenal glands. So maintaining healthy, appropriately working adrenal glands can help with stress hormone production like cortisol and adrenaline, but also help with DHEAS production, which then also helps to moderate your estrogen.
Right. Yeah, so the adrenals, you've got the ovaries, you've got the brain kind of signaling down. There's so many players to talk about in this picture of female hormones, and they're all contributing, and they're all in their own way, right?
Right.
And just out of curiosity for the people who may be wondering, but what is pushing my estrogen to be high or low? what is it that I'm maybe being exposed to that is causing this to shift? What conversations are you having with that respect?
Right. So estrogen, understanding how you might have too much estrogen is dependent on a couple of different factors. One is your own internal production of it. Um, to understand that, estrogen is produced from testosterone, and what drives that is an enzyme known as aromatase. So, in order to maintain a healthy aromatase level and function, you want to maintain a healthy diet. Whole foods, not a lot of processed grains and sugars. Those things will drive up insulin, and insulin increases the function of aromatase. So it will increase the conversion of testosterone to estrogen. So diet is a big factor in that, but stress plays a role in that as well, because when you are under stress and your cortisol level goes up, cortisol increases blood sugar, which then increases insulin, which then increases aromatase. So under stress, there may be higher conversion of testosterone into estrogen as well. Then there's external sources of estrogen. So there's chemicals, pollution, pesticides that are acting like estrogen in your body that are called xenoestrogens. So those external estrogens, what we want to do around that is try to moderate any intake of those things. So eating organic fruits and vegetables in order to not be taking in the pesticides, not consuming things that have been stored or heated in plastic containers. Plastic contains chemicals like BPA, which act as a xenoestrogen, so a chemical estrogen-like compound. So we'd like to avoid any intake of those things. Store food in glass containers. Don't heat things in plastic, heat them in glass. If you're sticking something in the microwave, you want to be using a glass container. So the other way of avoiding some of those pesticides and herbicides is looking at the Clean 15 list, which is produced every year by the Environmental Working Group. So ewg.org is a good resource for that. So avoiding the dirty dozen, which are the more heavily sprayed and heavily contaminated fruits and vegetables, or purchasing those only organic, and steering more towards the Clean 15, the ones that are lower in pesticide residues.
Mm-hmm.
The other is your liver is responsible for removing excess estrogen or those chemicals, pollution, pesticides too. So in order for the liver to function well, it has to have certain ingredients. It's got to have vitamin B6, vitamin B12, magnesium, something called indole-3 carbonyl, and calcium D-glucarate, which are found in cruciferous vegetables. It's got to have magnesium. It's got to have folic acid in the active form of folic acid, which is L5-MTHF or methyl tetrahydrofolate. So you want to have those ingredients available so your liver is able to properly process and remove any of those things. And that's leafy green vegetables and cruciferous are good food sources for that.
Mm-hmm. So we've talked about, nutrition, which I think is always a milestone in anything naturopathic medicine, getting those dark leafy greens, eliminating anything that can be a little more of a toxic burden, so to speak, on the liver as it's processing, anything that we're taking in. What other lifestyle practices do you find are quite beneficial to support hormone health and stress management?
So a lot of the things that we would normally recommend for stress include things like yoga, meditation, tai chi, breathing exercises, regular exercise. All of those help to moderate cortisol, which also will help to maintain a more stable blood sugar, which is going to bring insulin down, which is going to help prevent any excess production of aromatase or excess aromatase activity and excess production of estrogen. The meditations had lots of research behind it in terms of supporting stress adaptation, but also even for women post-menopause, that the signs and symptoms of a lack of estrogen are significantly better for women who undertake a yoga practice, which includes a meditation component to it. So if any of those signs or symptoms of menopause, a 12-week practice of yoga that includes some mindful meditation helps to moderate the symptoms that women experience at menopause. So that also would imply that it's moderating their hormone balance.
You know, I think you've probably reached out to a lot of people who can relate to what you're talking about. She's describing me. I have acne. I have the worst painful periods. I'm in bed for 5 days and I just can't get myself up. My mood is low. And maybe they've already started to cultivate some of the practice you've touched upon, and have not necessarily seen much improvement. So with that, what would you say, that naturopathic medicine can really offer for people to still help support that navigation and, bring them to better balance?
Right. So I do see, lots of women who, I eat clean, I exercise regularly, I think my stress is not out of hand, and yet I'm still suffering with these symptoms. So the kind of things that I would encourage in that type of person, we've already done the key foundational things, which are that the diet, stress reduction, exercise is always key foundational components of any hormone balancing regimen. But in addition to that, perhaps in this person, their level of certain vitamins and minerals are inadequate. And even though they're eating the right foods, maybe the food supply is depleted in certain vitamins and minerals. We know this just because the soil is depleted in it. Magnesium is one of those things. Under stress, the demand for magnesium is high. The soil is depleted in it. The plants don't get it. Even if you're eating the right plants, you're still not getting enough magnesium. So sometimes it is essential that we have to add in supplemental versions of some vitamins and minerals in order to restore supplies and stock people back up. Those would be things like vitamin B5, B6, vitamin B12, folic acid in the active form, vitamin C, magnesium, and zinc. Those are ones I find often there's a high demand under stress and sometimes just not adequate supply from food. And these all have, particularly B6, magnesium, have hormone balancing effects. They also have neurotransmitter balancing effects. So they help with mood because they help the brain to make the right amounts of serotonin and help the body make the right hormones, which influence how well those serotonin receptors work. So estrogen, progesterone levels influence how the brain uses the neurotransmitters it has produced. So we may be producing serotonin just fine, but because the hormone levels aren't adequate, you're not using them properly. So in addition to that, there's herbal adaptogen formulas that people can use to try to help their body adapt to and handle stress and uncertainty more easily. My personal favorites as far as adaptogens are things like rhodiola, ashwagandha, schisandra is especially a favorite, and gotu kola. And then there's specific herbs that we can use also to help to balance out female hormones. So if someone's showing obvious signs that their progesterone level isn't right, maybe we want to add in chaste tree or vitex. And then in addition to that, if there's showing signs that their estrogen level is not right, so we might want to add in herbs like dong quai or angelica, black cohosh, and peony in order to assist with estrogen levels.
So, I mean, I hope whoever is listening to this really should still feel empowered that they're doing the right things and they're on the right track with making changes in their lifestyle. But maybe they need a little additional support with the guidance of a naturopathic doctor to figure out, where they need a little more support, or, targeting whether it's their adrenal health or their blood sugar regulation, and starting to put those pieces together.
Oh, absolutely. Like you're never doing a bad thing
Yeah.
by taking care of your diet, stress reduction, exercise. And you never know what you've prevented by doing all of those things. Maybe you would have come down with something that you have prevented. That's the one thing about preventative medicine where it's not, it's difficult to motivate people sometimes only because they don't know what they didn't get because they did those things. Then on the other hand, if they're still suffering, then there's still some work that needs doing. And
Mm-hmm.
that's where interventions like you and I can do are things that might just help to move the needle that much farther for them.
Yeah. So, I think you have provided such an abundant amount of information. And I hope, people are finding it very useful and again, are just feeling empowered to realize that there's so much that they can do with respect to their health and stress and their hormones. If there's anything that you would really like people to take away and sort of hold on to for the rest of the day after they've watched this, what would you say?
Yeah, so key takeaways are definitely do all those good things that are good for you. It's hard sometimes when you're feeling stressed, you're feeling overwhelmed. The last thing people are capable of doing sometimes is pulling themselves together enough to go exercise.
Mm-hmm.
But it's one of the very best things that they could do. And sometimes what helps is just to think of it as, okay, I'm going to go for a 5-minute walk. But because that's a much more manageable idea than thinking I'm going to go for a run for an hour.
Right.
So getting outside and going for that 5-minute walk while maintaining physical distance um, can help once you're out there doing that 5 minutes to keep you going. But it's sometimes a lot more manageable, especially under periods of very high stress. To think of it in it's very small baby steps. Just take that one first small baby step and do that one thing, even if it's just getting one good meal today, or meditating for 5 minutes, or going for a walk, or getting some exercise, doing an exercise video in your living room. Something that just moves the needle that much farther. And then if you're feeling like things are still not where you want them to be, or where you feel that they ought to be, or not optimal, that's where professional support can sometimes just help that much more. A separate set of eyes, even for myself, having somebody else look at things from their own point of view sometimes makes all the difference.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Pamela Frank. This has been wonderful, and I hope everyone at home has really enjoyed our session today. If you like what you saw, make sure that you check out her upcoming webinar, Women's Health 101, on April 13th at 7 p.m. You can find more information on her website at forcesofnature.ca. Make sure to follow Dr. Pamela Frank on Instagram at Toronto_naturopath, Facebook, and Twitter. All of this will be posted on the Scale Up Naturopath social media channels, so you can find that all there. Make sure to follow Scale Up Naturopath, and if you liked our video, make sure to let us know with a like, and let us leave a comment below, and stay tuned for our next episode. Thank you so much, Dr. Pamela Frank.
Thank you, Dr. Christina.